Welcome to the next edition of the Tribal Justice Seminar Series, presented by UC Davis Law School, Aoki Center. And UC Davis would like to acknowledge that they are existing on the ancestral lands of the Wintu Nation, and they would like to acknowledge that they are doing that. We encourage you to turn on your cameras. What we're trying to do is build a community of practitioners. Although you may have very limited opportunity to talk to each other, this is like being in the room with each other. And we can see that we're not alone in the work that we're doing. So we invite you to turn on your cameras and participate. And if the opportunity presents itself, we're going to try and drop you into chat rooms to get to know each other a little bit. I also want to explain that at the end of the presentation, there will be an evaluation. That evaluation comes with an opportunity to win a raffle. The program is giving away a Pendleton throw each week, and we have 108 participants so far today. Generally about half complete the evaluation. So your odds are pretty good. If you complete the evaluation, you have a decent chance to win that throw. Last week's winner was from the Gila River Indian community just south of Phoenix, and that was Charles Aragon. So Charles, somebody will be contacting you to make sure they have the shipping information, and your throw should be to you hopefully within a couple of weeks. My name is Bill Thorne. I'm Pomo Coast Miwok from Northern California. I've served as a judge for almost 40 years. I started in tribal courts, so I've worked in 30 different tribal courts in a dozen different states. I served as a state trial judge for 14 years and the State Court of Appeals for 13 years. And I want to acknowledge the honor that I've been given to host this series. Chad Smith, the former principal chief at Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, is the project director. And I certainly want to acknowledge that John Miller is our attorney and tech guru who keeps all of this running. And without their yeoman's work, this would not have happened. I get to be the face, they're the substance of what's going on. So thank you to both of them. We're lucky today to get an opportunity to have an insight into how the real world operates. We have Tahlina Nofire, who is a tribal member and has also served as the attorney for the tribal council. That's sometimes a very fine line to walk. I have served as a tribal attorney, and it's not an easy task. And I suspect it's even harder when you come from that community. So I was the tribal attorney at Shoshone-Bannock in Idaho, but as a California tribal member, I wasn't quite involved as deeply in the family politics, where even if you're not involved, people assume you are. Tahlina comes from that community. Her family has been active for a long time in that community, so I'm sure she has some special insights. But she's going to share with us the ins and outs of what it's like to be a tribal attorney. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box. We will, at the conclusion of this hour, leave the Zoom open. So if you want to visit with people, if you want to ask follow-up questions, feel free to participate just like you would after a regular conference session, where some people mill around and talk to each other, and talk to friends and meet new people. We want you to have that same opportunity, because the goal of the project is to build a community of practitioners. Judges, lawyers, workers, staff people, community members, all the people who are concerned with tribal justice. So once again, welcome. And Tahlina, I'll ask you to just do a very short introduction and then take it away.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate this opportunity to get to talk a little bit about my experience as a tribal council attorney. My name is Tahlina Nofire. I am a Cherokee citizen. I was born and raised in a little bitty community called Welling, Oklahoma. Very rural, far northeastern Oklahoma. My family is from a place in Adair County called No Fire Holler. And I spent most of my summers running through the woods there with my friends and family. Spent a lot of time on the creek there. And I knew that I always wanted to help my tribe at some point, didn't know for sure how. In college, I was fortunate enough to have a professor who encouraged me to go to law school because we needed more Indian law practitioners. And so I took a leap of faith. Uh, Somehow, thankfully, made it into a law school. Went to the University of Tulsa. I got my certificate in Native American law, and I've been in practice for about 15 years, and I've pretty much done nothing but tribal law, which is just about anything and everything. So that's what I do. I was a former tribal council attorney for Cherokee Nation, and currently I am representing a lot of tribal citizens right here in Cherokee Nation. So, and today I hope that I will be able to share with you some insight on what it's like to be a tribal council attorney, and maybe give some tips or things that I did, or looking back, maybe I wish I would have done. And I have a slideshow mainly to help guide me. Let's see if I can share this. This is the first time I've done this. Let's see. Can everybody see that? Good. Okay. Let's go through here. So these are some of the things I'm going to talk about today, and I added in a picture of my dad and my grandpa. And this this is just to show why I do what I do is because of my family, and my family who was born and raised here. And I have a picture at the end. I'll tie it all in together. But when I see a picture of my family, it reminds me when times get tough in my tribe, that these pictures remind me of why I do what I do, because I love my family and I love my tribal citizens. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what your role is as counsel for the council. And I put that in quotation marks because at one point we were all getting confused on how to spell council versus council. What is the council, and who's the attorney, and how do you spell it? And even I was getting confused at some point. Your knowledge and scope as a tribal council attorney, who your client is, that came up more than often for me, and what it's like to represent your own tribe, and some of the things that will come up when it's your own tribe. So let me adjust this. So roles and expectations of the tribal council attorney. Your role will depend, and it will be defined differently depending on the organization of your government, which is for most tribes set up by the Constitution. So I put two different scenarios. You might have a 3-branch government, which is what Cherokee Nation has, where we have a separate legislative, separate executive and judicial branch. Or you might have a tribal council that's the governing body, which is led by a tribal chair. So if your council is elected, you must remember that you are representing politicians. And when you come at it from that point of view, I think that you understand that it's not just your tribe, but you got to think of them as actual politicians because they're elected. I was not prepared for the politics that would be involved in representing a tribal council. And I think for most people that serve on a tribal council, they expect their attorney to know that going in, and to remember that this is a that you're representing politicians. I'm having trouble seeing something. I need to, oops. All right. Also, my recommendation is to be aware that although politics do exist, that your role is to be an independent, objective legal advisor. And sometimes that, especially within your own tribe, that's harder, it's easier said than done. Also, your expectations, the expectations may be different from your actual role. So when going into this, if you, depending on how many council members you have, every one of those council members have different expectations as to how you're going to, what your role is going to be. And that may be different from what your actual role is. You may be expected to attend certain tribal council events on behalf of one tribal council member. Well, maybe at that event, you're expected to answer legal questions from those constituents. Those are just situations that can come up that may be expectations from a certain council member, but it might not be what your actual role is. So what I encountered when I came in to this, and I didn't have a lot of guidance on where my role stopped and started, depending on the scenario. I depended a lot on my state bar's ethics rules. I didn't think I would have to, but I leaned on them heavily because there were so many different scenarios, and the scenarios aren't necessarily covered under those. If your tribe has an ethics rules for attorneys, if it's adopted by the tribe, you would look at those. If the tribe that you're working for doesn't have that in place, I would recommend that as an attorney, you would maybe suggest that be adopted by the tribe. But I depended heavily on the rules of professional conduct. Today, I'll refer to some based on the American Bar Association because I know each jurisdiction is different. But I think that you should expect to be involved in intertribal disputes. And one of my practice tips is to know the tribe's political culture. I think that if you take that into account when you are giving legal advice, if you're representing the tribe in court proceedings, whether it's writing legislation, if you know what the tribe's political culture is, you're less likely to walk into a landmine, or you can better prepare for something that might be coming up that's very political in nature.
So Tahlina, you're suggesting that if you know the political culture, that you can work at staying neutral as opposed to taking a side accidentally.
Exactly. That is something that, and maybe I spent a lot of time learning that. And if you are a member of your own tribe, it may be easier because you already know the politics involved. But if not, if you can learn as much as you can, it does help you. It does help you. Your understanding and so you don't walk into a landmine, so you don't unknowingly side with something that's totally political, and now you're in hot water. So I think it makes it easier to navigate if you know what the political culture is, especially if it's during an election year. For sure, you're going to be in situations that you know are political, and you're going to have to give advice or do things for the tribal council, and you're going to have to be very careful because, like you said, that line is very, very narrow between, okay, am I giving an opinion on the law, or now am I persuading? Am I arguing a policy issue that should be done by the council? So I think it really is important. I tried to step away from the political culture part, but there's just no way when you're representing a council, it's so important that you know what that culture is and what the climate is.
So how did you deal, Tahlina, with the question of they're asking your opinion on something, but it's not really a legal question. They simply want you to step in and choose a side. How did you deal with that?
So there were times when I felt that that was coming, um, in certain situations where it wasn't necessarily legal. It was framed as a legal question, but it wasn't legal. What I would usually do is I would not really give an answer, or I would give an answer in the form of, here are the risks with what you may want. Sometimes I would know what they were wanting to be said. And so I would say, well, there's different options. I basically kept it wide open. You know, if it wasn't really a legal question, I'm trying to think of an example to throw out there. If I knew it was politically motivated, I usually adopted a stance where, if there was no right or wrong answer, I would give options. And then I would say, here's the risks. So at least the council could make their own independent decision. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you can't avoid a political landmine, but I always tried to give options, or if it was something that was highly contentious, I would give risks. I do a risk analysis, so that they would know, here are all the risks, here are the options, and they could then have a policy discussion on what's the best thing to do. And it was taken out of my hands.
And Tahlina, you were hired by vote of the council or by the chair?
So I was a contract. It's a contract job hired by the appointed. This would be our. Um, oh, my mind's drawn a blank now. I was interviewed by the entire council, but the person who actually hired me is our, and it's elected by the members of the council. It's our,
Like the executive director?
yes. And why I'm drawing, how come I'm drawing a blank?
Okay.
It's our, like our chairman of the council.
Okay, one of the questions I got was, do you think it would be different if there was not a 3-branch separation, but there was just the council? And then I'll add my own onto that. What would be different if you were elected by the people to be general counsel and not hired by the tribal council? So I'll close my audio and let you guide us.
So where we have a 1-branch government, I would expect that they would operate as the rule maker, and the attorney would probably also defend the tribe in certain legal actions. If that were an elected position, that does change things, because then you are a politician. And so you're going to have certain stances that are based on your platform, especially if you're allowed to campaign as an attorney. So you are going to have more involvement. You're going to probably be less neutral in that regard. It's hard not to. I'm not sure that that's the best way to represent a tribal council, having an election, because I feel like the council attorney should be you're one person who isn't political, who no matter what's going on within the council, whether there's a dispute within the council, there's an election, that tribal council attorney can at least, you can depend on that attorney and you trust that attorney to give their independent, non-biased legal opinion. And I kind of had the attitude, take it or leave it. If a council member didn't want to take my advice on what I said, that's fine. But at least I wanted them to know that they could at least trust me not to be swayed by politics. Does that answer the question? Did they?
Absolutely. And I like the fact that you emphasize that you have your own integrity you have to honor while trying to answer their questions and provide a service. But the bottom line is you have a line that you will not cross.
Right. And that's mine. And realize too that when you have a line that you won't cross, it can still be politicized. If the body that you're representing decides that they don't like that anymore and they want someone who is more one-sided. So it doesn't always work in your favor. But for me, I always felt like at least I was giving independent legal advice. And I think any attorney representing a tribal council, if they approach it that way, you're going to be respected. There's going to be other opportunities that are going to come up after that. And another slide I discussed in the same token that if you play heavily to a majority and you are very one-sided when it comes to politics, that can be detrimental because Indian country really is small. Indian law practitioners, there's still not a ton of us, and word gets around really fast, and then you can easily get a reputation quickly that you will play the politic part, and people don't like that. Other tribal councils are going to be leery of that if they know that about you. Can be, I guess. So the other thing I wanted to discuss a little bit is knowledge and scope. Some of the things that I think is beneficial to know when you're representing a tribal council. And I'm referring to the model rules of professional conduct 1.1, which is competency, which says a lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client. And I cannot see my full screen anymore. Whoops. I have that up there because I wanted to highlight that competent representation requires the legal knowledge. And it talks all about how you need to know all the legal things you might encounter as a tribal council attorney. But one thing it doesn't mention in the ethics code is it doesn't address the culture. And so when I'm looking at competency, I added in culture because even though it's not addressed by the rules of professional responsibility, I believe that knowing the culture of the tribe that you're working for is so beneficial. It is equal to all of the other laws that you should know about. That includes the tribe, the history of the tribe, cultural and the political organization of the tribe. And of course, I have the tribal constitution because that's the Bible of a tribe. I already knew my tribe's constitution, but I've worked with some other tribes, and that's usually the first thing I ask for is, let me see your tribal constitution. That's going to help guide me. Their ordinances, their laws, Tribal sovereign immunity is super important for a tribal law practitioner. Many times your tribal council will be approached asking for certain tribal sovereign immunity waivers. This is how my tribe was set up, that any waiver of tribal sovereign immunity had to come before the council for approval. And so I feel like it's really, really important for a tribal council attorney to know the pros and cons of those, what the limits are when you do waive tribal sovereign immunity. That's what our tribes are based on. It's so important that we take that very seriously. And I think you, as an attorney, you need to know the ins and outs of all of those waivers. And sometimes those waivers come before a tribal council from the business arm of the tribe, usually through contracts. So, and also in knowing about waivers of sovereign immunity, I think it's beneficial if an attorney knows, in addition to its own tribe that it represents, that you also know the effects of those waivers on other tribes. Because I think sometimes we forget we have over 500 other tribes out there, and sometimes what we do can affect other tribes in some way. So I think that that's something also to keep in mind. I don't know that it's super, super important, but I think it's important to be aware of that.
So Tahlina, in amending the Constitution, one of the questions asked, did you feel it was your role to bring that to the council and say, here's a way to make things better, particularly when a tribal member asked you? Or did you take the role as an attorney that you would respond if a council member or the group as a whole asked for advice on amending or changing a law?
So I think you said tribal member first, right? Tribal citizen first. So I had to separate myself from the tribal citizens, and I think I did a pretty good job of that. I laid really low. I tried to avoid any sort of public exposure that I could, to avoid those types of questions. But if an individual councilman, I would probably not answer that question or recommend that tribal citizen go to their council member and ask. Because I did make it very clear that I represent the council as a whole, and I don't represent individual tribal citizens. If a council member asked me that same question, of course I would give them guidance on that. I still, I would, one-on-one, I would give them my thoughts. If they wanted to bring that before the whole council and let's have a discussion, I was willing to do that as well. Because you will have individual council members who will come to you and ask you specific legal questions. Maybe it's something that's going on in the tribe, or it's potential legislation, things like that, that I would work with each tribal member individually as well.
Thank you.
So also, some of the other things that are probably most of you already deal with are any matters that may arise involving federal law, which would be, things, I just put some examples in the Child Welfare Act, PL 280, council or other internal policy. For me, it was our own tribal council internal policy for a one branch or really two branch government might even be HR policies, departmental policies, legislative drafting. I knew right away, because it was in my contract, that I would be writing legislation. I went into it not having any experience in writing legislation. So that was a huge part of my job too. So I looked for guidance from previous legislation that was drafted. I honestly went out and bought a book on how to draft legislation in plain language, because we, as attorneys, we know that there's even the misplacement of a word or a comma could change the entire legal meaning. So I was asked to draft a lot of legislation. Our main job was to, the main job of the legislative branch is to pass law. I would recommend, if you do not have any codification of your laws, that that should be a priority as a council attorney, is that you get those laws up to date and ordered, organized, updated in a very organized fashion. Some tribes actually pay someone else or a third party to update their laws. But if you are representing a tribe that doesn't have that updated, that's very beneficial to you to get that done, to the tribal council, and to the tribal citizens. Another thing is Robert's Rules of Order. I did not know that I would need to know Robert's Rules of Order. Just being honest, that's not something that they usually teach in law school, or it's not taught very often. So I had to very quickly learn Robert's Rules of Order. Some tribes, when they have their tribal council meetings, they're very informal. Some tribes have adopted Robert's Rules of Order. And so I had to learn that very quickly in case there was an issue with a motion. And typically the chair, whoever's leading the meeting, will know those Robert's rules and be able to run the meeting as they see fit. Sometimes some tribes may have a parliamentarian. For me, I did have to, especially if it was a highly contentious or a motion that maybe didn't come up very often, I would get asked on the spot what the Roberts rule was. Could they vote on this motion? Could we go into executive session? Things like that. One of my, well, I have two tips here, is if you're going to be writing any legislation, or you're going to be running some formal meetings, which you will be a part of, that if you do not know, that it would be helpful if you purchased a book on Robert's Rules, not the big book, which is like 600 pages, but there's like some quick guides to that and legislative drafting. Also, it would be very beneficial for you to learn the tribe's history and their culture, whether that's through documents or talking with elders or historians in the community. I think that's what sets us apart from other governments, is that we have the ability to include our culture into the drafting of our laws. And I think that from an attorney standpoint, if you know that history there and you know the culture, that you can draft legislation that will include some of that in there. And it's something that non-Indian legal attorneys wouldn't think of to have that kind of knowledge. On that one. So the other thing I ran into a ton is, who is the client? And at first it was really easy for me. I'm like, well, my client is the tribal council. Well, and for my tribe, there was 17 of them. So it's quite a large council. And, but as we got into different scenarios, it became less clear as to who my client really is. So I referred to the ethics rules a ton on this, and it did help some. Again, this is referring to an organization. It doesn't necessarily refer to a tribe. And this is where some tribal attorney ethics rules would come in handy for tribes. But a lawyer employed or retained by an organization represents the organization acting through its duly authorized constituents. You will have situations, I also put confidentiality in there, because you have a duty, you have a duty of confidentiality owed to each individual council member. Now that can get kind of confusing on, you have to remember that you don't represent that individual council member, but you do owe them a duty of confidentiality. Say, for instance, a council member comes up to me and says, I need some legislation written on something, but I want to work with you on this legislation, and I'll put it forth when it comes time to put it on the agenda. So I would write legislation for every single council member. Whether I agreed with it or not, that was just my stance. Every council member can present legislation. That was part of my contract. When it comes to, so there's certain things that a council member may ask you as a tribal attorney that maybe it's a legal question dealing with something that's going on with the tribe. The only time that might get sticky is if something they are talking about is actually illegal, and then that could have a detrimental effect on the council as a whole. And I think you would be okay with the ethics rules and disclosing that if that one person is actively engaging in illegal activity that's going to be to the detriment of the tribal council. I also added this ethics rule that I looked at is when you can represent an individual constituent, or here it says directors, officers, employees, members. When I say constituent, I mean council member. So I didn't run into this really, but I know that's something that can come up. Like, what do you do if a council member sued individually? Are you allowed to represent them? Do you have to get permission from the entire council? I didn't have that, thankfully. I didn't have that come up very often. I had someone who was called as a witness in a tribal court case. I was authorized to go to court, to the tribal court, on behalf of the council. But I think when it comes to who the client is and when do you, where your line is, if I was ever in doubt on who I was actually representing, I always acted through an absolute majority. I knew that, especially in highly divided issues, these could be whether to sue or not. Somebody wanted to sue somebody else in tribal court, or maybe it was executive branch, or maybe it was an external group. It's, who are you directed by when those sorts of conflicts happen? And especially in an election year, you're going to have a ton of conflict within that tribal council. And you're representing them as a whole, and you have to realize that they have other motives. They're politicians. We're in an election year, and when you have a highly divided council, if I had any question at all, I would always ask for an absolute majority vote. And that's how I acted, was through the majority. But what I will say about representing a majority, I think you have to be careful there too, not to ignore the minority. I really tried to treat the council members, and if you can, as equal as possible. You know, I never denied, and I wouldn't recommend denying writing legislation for one council member because they're in the minority. That's part of the playing politics that I would recommend against. It does not mean that you agree with what the council member wants simply by writing the legislation. Even if you give an opinion that's a legal opinion that's not popular, or maybe it is popular, but the minority council members don't like that. It doesn't mean you agree with it just because you're giving that opinion. And that's one thing that you will probably have to juggle, is being accused of being on one side or another, or at some point you think they all hate you. One of the tips that I have on who the client is to get those details and guidance about potential issues, either in your contract or in some sort of written document. Maybe it's a memo, so that you, and some of these questions I put in here, this would help you. It will help make your job easier. If you know who your point of contact is it the tribal chairman? Who authorizes you to speak or file court documents on behalf of the council? Does it have to be voted on? When there are politically divided councils, who directs the attorney? If you can have some of this, either in your contract, or maybe you send out a memo, it establishes what your expectations are, what their expectations are. And then when problems do arise, you're not caught in the middle of well, you shouldn't have done that, and you didn't have the authority to do this. And that's something that I wish I had. That's something I didn't have from the outset. And looking back, I wished I had those guidelines established.
So looking back, Tahlina, what pieces of advice would you give to new tribal attorneys, both if they're a citizen or a member of that tribe, or if they're an outsider? And would that advice be different?
I don't know that my advice would be different, whether you're a member of the tribe or I do think you have more invested when it's your tribe. There's more at stake there, and you can't deny that. But when some of my, one of my best recommendations is to know the political climate. Try to establish a good relationship with your tribal council individually, even. The more your tribal council trusts you, the better off things will be, even if you make a legal determination on something that's not popular, or maybe they don't like it, they don't want to hear this. But I really do think it's about establishing that trusting relationship. I think you'll find, for you that work in Indian country and you work with tribes, there's a lot of distrust politically. And if you can be that person that can be the trustworthy one, I think that's one of my best recommendations. You're not ever going to make everyone happy. I think I have some stuff on the current slide about representing your own tribe, that be prepared for tribal citizens to blame you for actions of the tribal council. You have to learn to not take a lot of things personally, which I think you will do more often working for your own tribe versus another tribe. And one of my tips are to limit your time on your tribe's social media group pages. I stayed under the radar pretty much for the most part, but it was for my own my own, I guess, mental health. It's the tribes, your tribe's social media group pages can be really harsh. And so for me, it was just best if I stayed off of those pages. And I think this is my last slide. I think one of the things, this is a picture of my grandma and my cousins. This is where I grew up with my grandma, spent a lot of time with her. My grandma, my grandpa, and my dad were both, they're all Cherokee speakers. And I think one of the greatest benefits of representing your own tribe is that you have the ability to empower your tribal council to do great things for your tribe. You have an opportunity to promote the best interests of your tribal people. And when things get really, really disappointing, because it can be pretty disheartening to see some of the things that happen, that you do have the strength of your ancestors. And looking at pictures of my family helps me keep moving forward, even through discouragement.